Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar from Spec Innovations, Requirements Management Using Innoslate. My name is Elizabeth Steiner, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. Before we get started, I would like to cover some quick housekeeping and a quick announcement. During the presentation, feel free to send us questions, and we will get them answered in the question and answer part of the webinar. You can also interact with us on LinkedIn through the Innoslate user group or through Twitter using the handle @Innoslate. The webinar is being recorded and we will make it available to you after the live presentation, so be sure to keep an eye out for it in your inbox. The quick announcement is that we have released our new Innoslate share space. You can use hundreds of formatted templates and standards that are already prepared. You can download the .no file and import it into Innoslate through the import analyzer. So after the webinar, please feel free to check that out. Now I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Mike Campbell. He'll be sharing with you how to get started with requirements management and analysis in Innoslate. Mike is a systems engineer here at Spec Innovations. He was a surface warfare specialist in the Navy. He has over a decade of experience performing risk assessment, risk management, cost-benefit analysis, and organizational functional analysis tasks. He earned his master's in systems engineering from Georgia Tech. I'm going to let Mike take over from here and we'll get started.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I do appreciate that in the introduction. Just so you guys are aware, I have been working at Spec for just over 11 years now, actually. It's a fantastic place to work, and I'm glad to be doing this webinar for you guys about requirements analysis and management. So our agenda is where do requirements come from? You know, what makes a good requirement? What's the difference between requirements management and requirements analysis? How does Innoslate make me a better requirements analyst and manager? And then we will jump into the tool to show a live demonstration, bringing in requirements and how to utilize the import analyzer or the requirements view to essentially make your requirements analysis a lot easier, smoother, and more efficient. And then we'll have time for hopefully questions and answers at the end. So essentially, where do requirements come from? So basically, how do I know any of these are good? Customers, I want an iPhone that is bulletproof, literally. Policy documents, you can find that in DoD 4540-0.05, change to enclosure 2, paragraph 2, etc. Based on, that's a long section for that document. Laws, that's in the US Code Title 50, Chapter 41, Subchapter 1. Analysis, here are the functional requirements we derive from user stories. Architectures, I have a lot of drawings, OB1s, DODAF, etc. So what can you do with these? And the models, here's my requirements diagram. It has everything you need. So again, how do I know any of these are good? Well, what makes a good requirement? The original customer requirement could be, an aircraft shall have 3 engines. The mindset behind that is or the rationale is that so it can land with an engine failure. Makes complete sense, but then we're not really asking ourselves, what's going to make that a good requirement, or why is that requirement good? Essentially, we need to figure out the functionality of the system in order for it to be able to land with 1 engine failure. So the new requirement would be shall be able to land with 1 engine failure. So here we're not specifying a particular design, which is essential as part of the conceptual part of any type of program or project. So we're actually just looking at the actual requirements of what we intend to satisfy based on a functional analysis. So like I said, here we do not specify the design with the requirement. We're just analyzing the requirement to make it a better one, to understand what's the functionality of the system, what do we need it to do. So again, what makes a good requirement? Now we have to add clarity to this. So a pot shall have 2 handles. And if you look at the picture on the left, it doesn't necessarily specify where those handles should be for efficient use of getting the food that you've cooked out of that pot. So we have to really identify that the pot's handle shall be placed in a line on either side of the pot opening. As we see normal regular pots today, they do have those the handles on either side, so that way it's easier to manage. In the same case, you can look at the watering can picture, and you can say, well, the watering can spigot shall be above the fill hole. Obviously, that's just going to do nothing but recirculate the water back into the fill can. So we have to refine that requirement and really tell ourselves that the watering can spigot shall face away from the handle. Makes complete sense now, and it actually gives us clarity on the requirement and how we're looking to determine the functionality of the actual product here. So we're definitely looking at not only just what makes a good requirement, but how clear is that requirement in terms of our management analysis of these requirements. So again, what makes a good requirement in this case? So the relationships, we need to have a relationship from the originating document. We need to be able to model elements from the requirements, and we also need to have identified validation and verification methods of these requirements in which we're going to be able to test the validity of the system against the requirement to make sure that it's actually able to satisfy or perform that requirement and meet that requirement for our customers. Coverage. So we need to ensure that the requirements verify what you're building and that it matches the requirement. So that's part of some of our end goal is part of the verification and validation of that. So we need to make sure that we are verifying that what we are building matches the requirement, and we also need to ensure that we're not over-engineering the actual product itself. What the requirements essentially are telling us is what the functionality of the system is, and as long as we're meeting those requirements, we'll prevent the over-engineering of a product. And also context. So it makes learning a system easier. Proper requirements will help you understand, or at least give you a very good idea of context about the functionality of a system, and that allows you to really make you learn the system easier and be able to capture the functionality in a much more efficient manner. So again, traceability is critical to having a good requirement, and we do that through relationships. We also manage, the validation and verification early up front, so we can then alter that as we move forward through the V and once we start getting a design together. But at this point, we're not trying to master a design or trying to come up with a design solution. We are trying to identify the functionality of a system, and that starts with good requirements. So again, what makes a good requirement? Well, this is something that we've embedded in the tool for years. Requirements need to meet a certain established criteria for quality. Is it clear, complete, consistent, design, traceable, verifiable, feasible, or correct? Now, the ones that are in green are what the tool actually checks for as part of the requirements analysis portion of this of the requirements management and analysis part of the views in Innoslate. Feasible and correct are not utilized against the quality checking score. So we have to essentially utilize human system interaction or human interaction in order to determine those two values and to ensure that we're meeting those. But again, you see the definitions here. One of the biggest things is that if the requirement is clear, it's unambiguous, it's not confusing. It is expressing a complete idea. It's not in conflict with other requirements, does not impose a specific solution. Again, we're trying to avoid any type of solution process here in which we're actually saying that this is what my product should look like just because that's what I think it should. The idea is we want to address the functionality, and that's where our requirements are going to start. So again, you may want to add others to these. The schema editor also allows you to do that as part of the requirements, but in this case, this is a good start, and this is a great guideline to really understanding how to write good requirements, how to identify good requirements, and then how to analyze requirements that are given to you and how to manage them. So essentially, we're looking for the what and not the how in this portion. So What's the difference between requirements management and requirements analysis? Well, according to Stevens and Martin, requirements management is the identification, derivation, allocation, and control in a consistent, traceable, correlatable, verifiable manner of the system functions, attributes, interfaces, and verification methods that a system must meet, including customer, derived, and specialty engineering needs. Right, that's a big definition, a lot of commas and a lot of words that actually do attribute a lot to what requirements management is. But essentially, we're identifying requirements, we're looking for any derived requirements in the requirement set that we get, we're allocating those requirements to specific actions that can satisfy those requirements, and we are looking for, control in a consistent and traceable manner in which we can verify the requirements against a set of actions and a set of tests to identify system functions and to validate those system functions in the long run. So again, it's just trying to break down all of those words into one specific identification. But requirements analysis itself also is the systems engineering technical process that results in a decomposition of the end user needs, usually identified in operational terms at the system level, during implementation of the stakeholder requirements definition process. And this can go on for a long time. This can utilize a lot of different interactions with the stakeholder to really get at what the implementation of the requirements should be, and the overall requirements that are considered as part of the baseline set to begin with. And this also allows you to look for any derived requirements that may either be potentially part of the system as part of this development cycle, or it could be a future development cycle. It really just depends on a few factors, but more or less, what can you develop in the cost schedule and performance that have been given to you as part of the schedule, and maintaining that schedule so you're not running into cost overruns, schedule overruns, etc. So managing and analyzing requirements ahead of time, taking your time and doing it, and being efficient about it is essential to the overall life of the project, mainly because you're trying to define what it is you're going to satisfy in terms of functionality so that the customer and the stakeholder are happy. So examples of requirements management versus requirements analysis. So requirements management baselining establishes a common base between stakeholders, control and manages scope and requirements creep, the track of requirements changes through the design process, and create baselines for milestone goals. Requirements analysis is quality and risk checking. So does the requirement meet the quality criteria? How can I change it to meet the criteria? What is the rationale for this requirement? And does this requirement pose a risk or create an issue? Are you doing both of these now, or does your tool support both? It's a big question, and some of the tools that I've seen don't necessarily do all of this. So how does Innoslate make me a better requirements analyst and manager? So key, but not all features, Innoslate features that support the requirements management and requirements analysis. We have requirements view. We have the ability to baseline requirements. We can do branching and forking of specific requirements, especially in terms of if you have different divisions of your company working on different areas of requirements, that can actually allow you to do that. We do have a history log in which gets captured for every entity. And we also have the quality checker, which is specific to the requirements view. And it runs off of the information that we talked about before with the, is it clear, consistent, complete, correct, designable, feasible, verifiable, traceable, those types of parameters and values. We can utilize the import analyzer to ingest a lot of requirements at one time through different various platforms like a .csv file, a docx file, etc. We can utilize the schema editor as well in order to manage requirements and capture information that may or may not be within the tool. So we're able to capture that information for future use. We can utilize the intelligence view. Intelligence view is a set of heuristics, I think 63 in all, which basically the tool runs a diagnostic on its itself, in the model that you're working in, and it basically utilizes those heuristics to determine how certain entities can be corrected, whether you have orphan entities or whether you have lowercase starting entities, things like that. Some are a little more important than others, but it's just something that as a user, you're going to have to work with, to interact with, and determine what is critical to the fidelity of the project and the overall benefit of the project in the long run. Then you also have to, look at the relationships to other classes, and the lifecycle modeling language has developed those relationships between requirements and other classes within the tool or within the language itself, based on the true ontology. And that true ontology allows you to really stay in a confined space of creating the relationships to those classes. And the tool really benefits you or allows you to do that based on the relationships as defined per class. Now you can create your own new relationships. There's nothing wrong with you doing that utilizing the schema editor. But if the relationship's not, if you don't find the relationship, then I certainly suggest you do it that way. The tool can also auto-generate requirements from models. As long as we have an action diagram and assets performing those actions, you typically can generate a set of requirements from those specific two diagrams, and it would be generated from the asset diagram. And then support for functional analysis and solution synthesis. So again, this is defining the what and not necessarily the how, and we're trying to really drive functional analysis utilizing requirements analysis and management. And it's determining the functionality of the system so we can then determine what our trade space is and start identifying the items or the methods in which the functional parts are going to be satisfied. And then we can start looking at specific architecture or physical architecture that's going to essentially drive a solution at some point based on trade studies, the trade space, and the amount of time that we're working with, based on costs as well. So is the real job just to manage requirements? Isn't it really to support the design and acquisition process throughout the life cycle? Well, I guess that's one for us to define, but let's at least get into the tool. We'll go back to essentially what we've been looking at as our agenda. So that's essentially going to be looking for where do requirements come from. We've gone through all the slides here, so let's just essentially go through the tool and we'll figure that out here. So if we get into the tool, basically we're going to have to sign in like I just did. And what we're going to be looking at is essentially a project. It could very well be a new project. I'm not apt to starting with that, or I can certainly start with a new project. And that's simply just going to creating a new project. I can give it a name, and we can certainly just have a basic name for this. So we'll start with that. You can add a description, but it's not essential at the moment. Description just gives a new person a really good idea of what the project is about, and where you're going with this project. So, and then you can choose another folder in which to put it with, but for the most part, we're going to stick with default. So I'll create a new project here, and we're just going to work with requirements in this site. Now, as you can see, I've got this menu up here, and you can see these are all links in which I can actually go to start with requirements analysis. You could start with a diagram. Some people do, and that's fine. We have a requirements diagram, and you can start identifying the requirements that way. But the easiest way to really do this is to actually import requirements. A lot of times you're going to get requirements based on the what the stakeholder is providing you at the beginning of a project or at the next iteration or development cycle of the project. And what you're going to be looking for are the requirements that really define the functionality of the system, to hopefully bring in and analyze those requirements so you can get an idea of what you need to satisfy as far as functionality. Doesn't matter if it looks hideous, even though the intention is not for the product to look hideous because it still needs to sell, but as long as you're satisfying the functionality of what your customer is looking for, most of the times the design of the system is not as critical to a stakeholder as much as the functionality is. So in this case, so utilizing the import analyzer is going to be one of your biggest keys in order to bring in any type of requirements. Now, you can utilize this import analyzer just by clicking on that link. And essentially what we've got, you can take in a bunch of different platforms here, like I said, but you can look at utilizing the CSV, the .csv import, or the docx import, which are the more common formats to be able to bring in to the tool. And what that essentially is going to do is, if I'm taking in a Word document, it's going to be basically, a lot of times we utilize that for policy or for statement of works, any type of project plans that have been given to us as part of the start of a project. And we can take those in, and a lot of times, maybe a concept of operations, we can create those documents as well. But those are some of those documents that are going to be brought to us and allow us to essentially to look at functional requirements and determining how we can take those requirements and not only utilize functional requirements, but also look at other types of requirements that essentially are a part of the program. So in this case, what we're going to look at is essentially, we can do a docx or an Excel import. I do like the Excel imports. For me, it's just easier. I can identify what I want to bring in based on the column headers, but you need, specifically, you just need the number, the name, and a description. You can add in a class too, especially if you have a lot of different classes of entities that you want to import as well. But for this part, we're going to do a CSV, and we're going to look at the default class that we'd like to do, which is always going to be a requirement. We can also add attributes in which we're fetching existing entities. So in this case, if we were just adding requirements back in, then they're gonna look for the global ID. And again, it's the same thing too. So you can do the global ID and then the name itself, or you can do a number if there's a specific number scheming pattern that you like. And then you can set the entity to specific class when description contains a certain word or phrase. So in this case, if I select this, we're going to look at requirement, and usually those words or phrases are shall, will, and must. So this is great for looking at a long list of requirements, and some of those are statements, and you're not necessarily sure which one of them are requirements. So the tool will help you drive that out if you look at these specific words or phrases. So so in this case, we're going to look at the CSV file. So I'm going to hit next. We're going to look for the file that I want to bring in, and basically you're going to look for it anywhere in your database here. So I have this. Let's see. Yep, I have this requirements document here. I'm going to open that up. It's going to look, and it's going to tell me there's a bunch of information in here. It's done, so I can look at next and customize a lot of the stuff that's here. I realize I have cleanup I need to do. So that as you can see, there's a lot of information that I've got on this. Most of them are relationships, and I don't necessarily need them all. So I'm going to, basically I've cleaned up that document already. So I'm just going to save this again as those requirements. And I'm going to bring it back to, where did I have it? Well, I'm just going to save it to the desktop so I don't lose that, and we'll leave it there. All right, and now I'm going to close that, and we're going to go back. So previous, click here to select, and then I go to my desktop. I'm going to get the requirements document, open that up, and then we'll see that it gets actually brought in. So here's the mapping that I just need to make sure is correct, and as long as it's class, number, name, description, that's perfect. So, and that's the headers that I had on the CSV. All right, and then I just have to verify that it's going to come in clean, and it does. So I'm going to save that, and that's going to basically import my requirements into the document. Now, as you can see, I did have some statements in here. So any headers like like the one that says functional requirements, those are considered a statement because there's no textual information there that tells me it's a requirement. Now, if the functional requirements had a statement under there, of course, that's going to be a requirement, and the tool would look for shall, will, or must if I had that box selected. So as I'm looking at these requirements, basically it's fairly straightforward. They're simple requirements. I'm not looking to to over complex a lot of different things, but the tool can handle a lot of different imports. And I'll show you that kind of as we get towards the later part of this. But I wanted to get into the functional analysis, or at least more of the functional requirements and how to manage those and analyze those as part of a project, or part of the up and front part of the project as you're looking at developing something. So in this case, as we're talking about, in this case, we're talking about an oil rig construction. Well, then, basically oil rigs are constructed where usual oil traps are found. And in this case, we do have to have a survey for oil. So, I'm looking at the requirements. The geologist shall survey for oil, and there is a decomposition here, which the tool shows me, of software survey for pressure. And, the user shall use the approved software for measuring pressure. That's not quite clear. I need to kind of refine that a little bit more. I need to find out what the software is, and then essentially what I'm going to do is include that into this description. So essentially, I'm going to look for some type of potential software research in which I need to utilize some type of software for the geologist, or just actually find out what the geologist is using. So again, this is not a very clear requirement, but it is a requirement that I need to do a little more research on, provide a little more clarification on the management of. But essentially, when I bring in the requirements, I want to be able to start the analysis process from a baseline. How good are these requirements up front, and what kind of analysis, what kind of work do I need to do in order to get these requirements up to a reliable level in which I'm increasing the fidelity of the requirements and bringing in an authoritative source of truth to start off the project, and be able to simply have a good set of foundational requirements to start with. Now, these requirements are very basic. They're going to start me off. I should expect to be able to do more requirements analysis, which could actually give me derived requirements. Now, derived requirements are also something that I could capture as a part of a document, which are requirements that are also seen from this requirement set, which can be captured as part of another requirement set, and which can be analyzed to determine whether you're going to utilize them now in this development cycle, or if you're going to utilize them as part of another development cycle. It really depends on the type of requirement, the functionality of that requirement, and how that requirement is essentially going to be developed, whether it's going to be something within this cycle or the next cycle, and can it be worked within that based on the schedule in which you're working within. So that's another part of what we're going to be looking at. But essentially, when I bring in requirements like this, I'm going to be looking for, how good is this requirement to start with? So we have this thing over here called the quality score. As you can see, all of them are zeros. And I also have a duplicate down here. That's okay. That usually just means that the numbering might be the same in some way or another, but and you can see that the description on that isn't quite good either. So again, it's cleanup, but it's good progress for me to understand how I can make this a better requirement. So the oil rig shall completing the well is not necessarily what's essential or what's going to be the functionality of this, because the oil rig is not going to complete the well. It's going to essentially be a decision in which the well is not profitable, and therefore when you complete the well, that's basically going to mean that you cement the cover and close up the actual drilling hole. And so that's going to essentially be done by people, and basically you pour cement in the hole and you close it up. So we're gonna, so essentially, like I said, we're gonna have to do the analysis on these. So I'm gonna run the quality score just to see how good these are to start the process. So as we ran a quality check, Oh, is that because I had the, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that duplicate out and run it again. So we're going to go to database view, and I'm going to take this and just delete it. Normally I wouldn't delete information like that, but it's something I need to make sure that I'm working on here. So we're going to run the quality checker again. There we go. So now, as you can see, they're not bad requirements. They are not necessarily clear. And so as we develop clear requirements, or these requirements have a lot more clarity to them, as we start to manage them, we're going to start to expand these descriptions, try to make them a little bit more clear, a little bit more refined. So if you look at entering the production phase, in this case, the oil rig shall enter production phase. Well, that's true, it shall, but something has to happen for it to occur. Usually it means that the oil rig needs to be set up for a production, in which you now have a viable well that's going to be able to generate pressure and generate crude oil, in which you can utilize as part of production. And that would be to utilize the actual production of crude oil and develop a logistical plan in which to extract it from the earth, bring it to, get it to facilities so they can actually utilize the oil in many different ways, and get it out to customers for, to buy and to be able to fill up cars with gas and utilize oil in engines and other things like that. So the production phase is a really big step in terms of the oil rig. So we're going to have to identify, how this oil rig will enter the production phase, and it's going to be not only changing this top level requirement, but it's also going to have a decomposition of other types of requirements. So what steps need to be taken for an oil rig to get into out of a exploration phase and into a production phase. And normally that has something to do with the size of the trap, if you're getting good pressure in the trap, and then being able to push pressure out of the trap and capturing that oil over a long period of time. This is where it comes down to, is the well economically viable? Because if it isn't, then you usually move on to something different. But if it is, then oil rigs tend to drill their starter holes and then get their actual starter digging down to a certain level. So working in requirements view here is essential to really getting your requirements to that level of fidelity, but also that level of clarity, where you want to specifically determine that level of, what are we doing here, and not the how are we going to do it. So, so again, we could go through all of these, for just to ensure that we're setting up the actual clarity of the requirement and understanding exactly what's going to be happening here. But for the most part, what we're doing is, at the top level, we're going to be surveying for oil, and the geologist shall survey for oil. Essentially what I want here is, the geologist shall survey for oil, using seismic waves along a pre-identified stretch of Texas coastline. Okay, it's a little more defined, it's a little more clear, gives me an idea of where I'm going to be doing it, where the geologist is going to be surveying for oil, and how, what type of equipment are we going to be using, utilizing seismic waves along a pre-identified stretch of Texas coastline. Great. That gives me an idea, just a really good idea of how we're going to survey, or why, what we're doing with surveying for oil. We're also going to talk about particular type of equipment. So something has to produce the seismic waves in which we're going to use this. So this is where the relationships come into play. So the survey for oil is just the name for this functional requirement, but essentially we have to have some type of action that's going to satisfy this requirement. So where that goes is what we're going to look at is, the geologist shall survey for oil using seismic waves along a pre-identified stretch of Texas coastline. Okay. So I'm going to open up the entity view. And what I want to do is I want to have something that's going to satisfy this requirement. So it does say satisfied by many here. Essentially, that's going to be utilizing an action. Okay, you can also utilize inputs and outputs to satisfy a requirement, simply as, if there's a deliverable due, or if you have a specific, output of an action which actually satisfies a requirement, meaning, like if you had a laser printer, and the laser printer, one of the requirements is that the laser printer shall produce paper, or a printed piece of paper. That printed piece of paper could be an input or an output of a action, and that can satisfy that requirement. So that can be utilized as well as part of a satisfied by. So that's why you typically tend to see this satisfied by many. But in this case, utilizing what the requirement tells me as I'm analyzing this requirement, it's going to at least satisfy some, be satisfied by an action of some sort. So in this case, we're going to, basically it's going to be, the action is essentially going to have some name that has a verb to start. So we're going to be looking at or talking about some version of an action. So an action is going to have a verb to start. So we're looking at, the geologist shall survey for oil using seismic waves. So in this case, the name of the requirement essentially is going to be, surveying for oil. Yeah, surveying for oil, and it could be along Texas coast. I wouldn't necessarily use the Texas coast, but you could certainly do that as well. So there's an action that satisfies that. You can add in a duration in which this happens. A lot of times this can happen in, in an 8-hour period. It could also happen in a lot more, longer time frames, depending on the size of the area in which they're going to survey. So you can also start to add in the relationships here that this was sourced by, meaning this requirement was sourced by an artifact. So being that we've already got an artifact in here, it was sourced by the oil requirements. I can select that as part of my relationship. Make sure you hit the green check mark, and that saves that relationship that's tied to this requirement. Again, this is giving you a lot of fidelity and a lot of source of truth for this requirement, so you can then satisfy it as well as maintain that it has been sourced by something that is not just coming out of nowhere. You actually have a document that is showing you this. Other things that will be sourced, that this requirement could be sourced by, could be some type of policy document as part of oil and gas safety, something like that. So you can also add those artifacts into here as well. And being that I've got this artifact in here, this is at least telling me these are my requirements. This is what I'm doing to analyze this. This requirement's been sourced by this particular document. So again, I've saved my action, okay? And now you can see I'm starting to build solid relationships in which I'm actually able to trace this requirement out. So it's just giving me a lot more clarity on the requirement itself, how it's being related to different things, what actions are going to satisfy this, and more. And there are a number of actions that can actually satisfy this requirement. And so, we want to make sure that we're keeping that traceability. Now, we also have to identify, the action itself. So surveying for oil along Texas coast is going to be performed by somebody. So in this case, it's going to be an asset. And that asset is going to essentially, could be surveyor, could be a team of surveyors, could be a specific piece of equipment, could utilize, a potential like overhead visual, tool of some sort that can actually measure or, identify types of oil traps from, maybe a helicopter view flying at, 2,000 feet over the identified area. But essentially what we're going to be doing is utilizing the asset relationship for this action because we want to make sure that the action is being performed by somebody and that that action is satisfying a requirement. So in this case, we're going to look at just creating an asset because I don't have the surveyor in here, but I'm just going to imagine a surveyor, a geologist, geological surveyor, Y-O-R, who is going to come in and utilize and work with this requirement as part of this action to satisfy that requirement. And they're going to give me a time and a cost and everything like that, and we can certainly generate all of that in here. But essentially, what they're going to do is generate an input and out. This survey is going to generate an input and output. What that input and output is going to be is essentially a seismic image of the survey data from that survey. So it's going, and that data is going to be compared against any other data that's been captured on whether it's on good oil traps or not so good oil traps. So that's essentially how we're going to look at how this requirement can be satisfied, and if we, how we're going to be able to move that requirement further, or if we're going to kind of stop it at this point. Now, all of this can also be done more simply with modeling. But in this case, what I wanted to do was to at least go through the back end of this, take the requirement, be able to relate it to an action so I can then have something satisfy that requirement, and then have that action be performed by somebody so I can identify potentially, the types of assets or the types of personnel that are going to need to be able to do this as part of my project. So I'm going to make sure that I save that entity. It's going to take me back to my requirement, and I can go back to my documents view, and then I can look at that I've satisfied this requirement based on the fact that I've created those relationships, and now I see this green S right here, and that tells me that the requirement's been satisfied. So what's next? Well, there are many other ways to really help to manage or to analyze these requirements, but essentially you want to analyze these requirements one by one by one. I don't know why it's, I know why it's doing that. Essentially, you want to manage these requirements, in a singular sense, and you want to make sure that you're being able to provide more clarity for how these requirements are given to you. Again, as someone who's been doing this for a while, there hasn't been a set of requirements that I've been given, or at least looked at, that have been perfect, because there's not a set of requirements that typically come from a customer who are going to essentially give you fantastic requirements to start off with. First of all, they're going to ask for the world. Second of all, you have to justify what you can do within a certain time frame based on what your customer or your stakeholders are providing you. And then doing the requirements analysis is one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle, because you have to be able to understand what it is you're trying to build in the sense of the functionality being satisfied here. And this is before acquiring any piece of equipment or any type of testing material, and creating those test cases to actually test any physical architecture. So doing the analysis up front prevents a lot of that, and it saves a lot of time if you can do a synthetic solution where you can simulate the data and actually verify that you're on the right track based on the data that you're getting. That's all down the road. This is just requirements analysis, and it's an essential part of utilizing what we can do in the tool to further enhance the full life cycle of what we're doing as system engineers. So not only going from your context analysis and concept design, or concept of operations and the functionality of what we're doing, but essentially also working across the V to determine what's my next iteration, what's my next development cycle, how are we going to improve this, what technologies are on the horizon, is there anything that I can start to research now that's going to be efficient or more effective on a product 5 years from now. What kind of technologies are sitting there at TRL levels of 2 and 3 or 4 and 5 that might be available to me in, say, 2 years. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to be looking at as part of the requirements analysis and the requirements management. And it's determining, what do I need up front to satisfy the functionality of what's being asked for now, and then how can we make that more efficient as you know, where we have a successful product now, and how can I make that more efficient with either derived requirements or potential requirements down the road based on some technological advances that you might be aware of as you do any type of trade space studying. So as we look at all of these requirements, we want to make sure that we're just cleaning them up, making them more clear, making sure that the traceability is accurate and that it's correct, because we want to make sure that we're giving our project enough fidelity that it in and itself is an authoritative source of truth, but it's also maintaining a level of fidelity that that you're not just throwing stuff to the wall and hoping it sticks. So requirements are the foundation for this. Now, let's just say we've gotten to the end of this and we're all good here. Again, I don't know where all this came from. Let's just say that we've gotten to the point where we need to be, and essentially what we're going to do. I know what this is. This has two parents. Open the entity view. Let's go to functional requirements. That's okay. I'll figure it out. It's something easy. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to go to we'll go back to the requirements, and let's just say that we've gone through this analysis, and these are the requirements that we want to maintain as a foundation, as a baseline. We have the ability to baseline these requirements, and we can just, I can look at these requirements and I can say, okay, they look good. I do have one that needs to be improved a little bit, but there's not much more I can essentially do with it. At this time, stakeholder wants to baseline these requirements. So we just hit the baseline button and we give it a name, and it's going to be my oil requirements version 1. And you can identify this however you'd like as far as the name goes. This allows me to create or at least identify my first version of my baseline. What that allows me to do, first of all, the baseline is going to create a snapshot in time of the actual requirements that you have here. Once that requirement changes, it now starts a new set of requirements, and that allows you to revert back to the baseline if you need to, if that requirement changes and for some reason it didn't need to be changed, or you need to update requirements as a second part of the actual project. So believe me when I tell you, requirements will go through a number of iterations until you get to a specific set of requirements that can be approved, maintaining the functionality of the system, as well as also being able to be able to define the architecture that can help those actions or satisfy those requirements, and identifying the assets that are going to be that part. So so it's just making sure that we are pushing that envelope of identifying and having clear, concise requirements that identify what's happening in a single sentence, without a lot of conjunctions, without a lot of different types of language that's going to essentially distract us from what is really trying to happen here. So we can create that baseline, and that essentially has now created that snapshot and allowed me to create this foundation. And I can always go back to the original requirements. So you can see here's my baseline. I can go back to the original requirements. Of course, now it's not doing what I wanted to do, but that's okay. So let's just say I start looking at these requirements again. I'm like, I can do better on these, and especially with these quality scores, I want to kind of get them up into the green a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to open up the entity view, and I'm going to look at the criteria for what makes a good requirement, much like what I talked about in the slides originally. So as you can see, I do have the description here. I know that description can be updated, mainly because I have a conjunction. So here I've got the oil rig, shower remove, the drill pipe, collar, and bit. Okay, I get that. So essentially what I'm going to actually do with this is split those up into 3 different requirements. So the oil rig, shower remove the drill pipe, it shower remove the collar, shower remove the bit. Those are 3 different requirements because essentially what you're saying is that it's going to remove all three of these at a single time, all the time. And that's not necessarily the case. Essentially, you can remove a single drill pipe without having to remove the collar and the bit. The drill pipe might have been compromised in some way, so the requirement really needs to be just about a singular unit, no conjunctions, avoid those types of pitfalls with any type of commas, conjunctions, so like and, or, includes this, that, and that. Those are the types of things to avoid when you're looking at your requirements. So, and the tool will also give you recommendations on how to improve it. So in this case, is this a complete requirement? Well, no, because it contains a comma, and it says consider splitting into multiple requirements. There's also an and here, which is another conjunction. So I've got two conjunctions, and it's telling me to consider splitting into multiple requirements. So I'm going to utilize that, and let's just say that I've done that, but I can take the collar and bit out, at least for this part. The oil rig shall remove the drill pipe. Okay, so now I can say that this is a yes, and the recommendations go away. I've satisfied those recommendations, and you saw that the score went up. Now, the other things that I have to look at is this feasible? And is it correct? And if you remember the definition of correct, and I don't remember it off the top of my head, and I should, but the definition of correct is just meaning, does it coincide with any other requirements? So for this case, no, I don't think it does. So I'm gonna make sure that it's correct. And yes, the score didn't change, that's okay. And feasible, is this an actual feasible requirement? Can it be done? Is it able to be done? Can I verify that it'll be done? Well, it's verifiable. I can certainly verify it. And the oil rig shall remove the drill pipe. That's feasible. So the answer is yes too. And then I'm going to save it. And you saw that the score did go up to 100. It's right there. And so, and then you also saw that the color has changed on the left-hand side from blue to orange. So now I've created a new requirement, and I've upped its score to 100%. And again, I can start looking at my relationships and start to go through those and start to really identify and trace those out to give this project a lot more fidelity and maintain the integrity of the project based on what I'm doing here for requirements management, as well as analyzing the requirements to hopefully set up this project a little bit further and take it into my action modeling, and taking those actions into actually setting up and creating my action diagrams to simulate at some point and get further down the line into identifying physical architecture once I realize that I've got a good functional model of what I'm doing based on functional requirements. Now this is, essentially what's going to come from requirements is not only the functionality, but it's going to be performance requirements. You're going to be looking at other types of requirements in which you can look at environmental requirements. You can look at specific project requirements, program requirements. You can look at cost requirements in terms of certain performance actions in which you don't want to oversee or to have a cost overrun when you're starting to. So if requirements analysis, they gave you've got $1 million to do requirements analysis for a year and a half in order to analyze over 1,000 requirements, and I'm just pulling numbers out of thin air here. So there could be a requirement that is programmatic. That's that simply says that $1 million. The requirements analysis phase shall maintain a cost of less than $1 million or less than equal to $1 million, and that allows you to again identify a programmatic. And we've got labels that you can utilize in order to separate those out. So like I was mentioning, you have an environmental requirement here, functional requirement, and especially when we're talking about surveying for oil, you're definitely going to have environmental requirements as you deal with OSHA, as you deal with the EPA and other various organizations that are going to be looking for that. There's policies that you have to make sure that you're meeting specific guidelines and specific safety requirements that also are part of this. So again, like I said, we have performance requirements, reliability requirements, safety requirements, and then a verification requirement. Verification requirements aren't going to come until you've already done modeling and whatnot, the simulation, and you're looking at acquiring and setting up your test cases. And this is how your verification requirement is going to set up or lead you into the test case. So, so with that, I hope that I've been rambling a lot. I can usually talk a lot, and that's not a problem for me, but I have gone over a lot of being able to import requirements, taking those requirements, running the quality score, categorizing those requirements in terms of essentially giving them a label, which is what those are over here on the left. I've been able to show you how to baseline the requirements, how to improve the quality score of the requirements through entity view, and I've also shown you how to when you baseline the requirement, that you're setting up a snapshot of time of those requirements and how we utilize those requirements to make new requirements, which I've shown also here when we're doing the analysis of that. So essentially, as you import requirements, you could baseline those as your first version, and then as you improve those requirements, your second version could be, just the analyzed requirements themselves, and you could set it up that way as well. The functionality through the tool is not just a straightforward path. It's not linear. You can utilize these in different ways, and you can take the functionality from the model, or you can take the requirements from a model as long as you have actions that are performed by assets. And so the more mature project of this is one that I've used quite often. I've got multiple requirements documents in here, coming from the geologists themselves, personal protective equipment, any type of oil rig requirements that I've got set here, and these were actually generated from the diagram. And so I've got multiple levels of diagrams. I utilized somebody was messing with this one, but that's okay. I've used it as an example, but this is essentially the high level diagram that I've utilized, and I can generate requirements from the asset diagram from here. Actually, it's if I go to this and I go to open entity view, and then I go to the asset. So we'll go to the driller, and then we'll go to open asset diagram, and then from here we can generate an SRD, which is your system requirements document, and that's essentially going to give me a baseline name. So this would just be for testing purposes. And then we generate the baseline, and that allows, you'll see it'll come up with a document, and now I've got all of these requirements that have been generated from that view based on that. And some of these are just guidelines, others are, the tool saw them as a way to be able to identify a function requirement of some sort based on the label that it gave it. So that's another way to actually create requirements. So with that, I want to leave time for questions and answers here. I know I'm close to time limit on the end, but I do want to answer some questions and make sure that I'm addressing those as we end the session here. So I'll stay on after for a little bit, and we can move into the questions and answers.
Thanks, Mike. We already have several great questions. If you haven't had a chance to do so, use the panel on the right to ask your questions. Let's get to our first question. Can you do an import from a docx?
Absolutely. It's actually one of the easier ones, as so you just have to go to the import analyzer. And if you go to the first default one is going to be the word.x. And if you wanted to, I have a document that I can upload, but for the most part, you just have to run through the steps here, hit next, and it's going to ask me for a document. So let's, no, I don't want to do that one. But for the most part, you can take any docx and it'll bring it in. Just for an example. And it's not going to look pretty to start, and that's okay, but you can see that it has identified it as a requirement. This is one. And then there's sections that it's identified. Those are easy to clean up for, for this. If it was a large document, then I'd want to try and figure out how to do that, prior to bringing it in. But for the most part, this is, it's fairly clean. And I can just renumber these as part of, adding different requirements. So I can save that, and it comes in like this. And then all I have to do is select it and then add after or add a child and copy paste it, and it goes further. But when you're doing this as a long part or a long portion, I don't, it's a lot easier to do the preview and then try to fix your issues after or prior to importing and saving it into the database. So just think about that as you're loading this in. But all you really need is a number, a title or a header like this, and a paragraph, and it will bring it into the tool. You just have to make sure that it does it nicely. So yes, it can bring in a docx version of a document.
Thanks, Mike. And just to add on to that real quick, if you use the Microsoft headings, it really comes in much nicer than this.
Yeah.
Our next question is, importer relies on shall, will. Can it be used with action verbs? If so, is there a limit on number of action verbs?
So the importer, yes, can be used with actions. So here, the nice thing is that, I can change whatever default class I want to bring it in as. So if I have a list of actions, I can bring them in as an action. I can also utilize that as a CSV file. So I can change the class to actions. And then if I have a list of actions that I want to bring in, I just bring it in through the CSV file, and it'll load them as actions. And it won't show you, it'll just bring you to database view. It won't bring you to the actual documents view. It'll bring you to database view, and you'll see a list of your actions listed there, and they will all be actions.
Thanks, Mike. Our next question is, are you able to enter constraint on the requirement?
That's a good question. You can add, that's a good question. I know that there are properties in another tool that utilize constraints, but in this case, actually that's not the document I wanted. In this case, if you look at a requirement, you can actually add, I have to think about the answer essentially, but you can, it won't be a constraint to start, meaning it's not going to be something that's going to be identified here. You can utilize the schema editor to create that relationship, that it does create a constraint. I can certainly say that there are relationships that do create constraints on requirements or on different classes. This might be something that I need to take a look at a little further, but for the most part, you can utilize the schema editor to create a constraint relationship where, it creates a constraint, and then you have to identify the constraint. You set the parameters for that constraint. So at least it can be identified. You could also utilize as it incurs an issue or creates an issue, and the issue can be that constraint as well. So you can utilize the issue as part of that, in terms of, here causes issue as a, as identifying the constraint on that particular entity.
Our next question is, can a list of acceptable action verbs be set so they do not have to be entered every time an import is performed?
Can a list of action verbs be set so the list doesn't have to be imported every single time? Okay, that's a really good question. I have never done that with this tool. I can't say it can't be done. I just have never done it, but I know in the, I believe in the Innoslate documentation, well, that's a good question. What I will do is, I'm going to take down that question. I'll get the person who asked it, and then I will answer that at a later time. Because I've never done it, and I don't want to point you in a different direction of which I hadn't done it before like that. So if it can be done, I want to know, and that way I can give you the correct answer.
Thanks, Mike. Another question, can you have more than one action verb in a single requirement?
Wow. So more than one action verb in a single requirement, that essentially, yes, essentially but it has to be describing something completely different. It cannot be describing two different types of actions, meaning it's not going to be a conjunctive verb in which you're going to say, it shall do this, meaning perform this, as well as performing this, meaning you could have a performance type, but you can also add in a level of, safety. So you could have it say, the system shall perform at 95% reliability under certain, within safety safety parameters of, or maintaining safety or acceptable safety parameters within by OSHA standards. So you can certainly have those types of action or verbiage in there as that, but as long as it's not saying the system shall perform, at this certain level, but as well as also perform at this level. It doesn't, essentially what you're doing is creating two different requirements. So while you could do, like I said, the first place, you could do the performance and then, while maintaining safety requirements from whatever governing authority, that allows you to utilize two different action verbs in the same requirement without actually trying to give maybe a performance requirement where you have the high and the low already there. So yes, you can. Short answer.
Thanks, Mike. Our next question is, do requirements retain their ID if and when other requirements are added or deleted?
If they are deleted, no. The way the system works, it runs off the global ID, which is a random number, and that allows you to, the global ID essentially allows you to, as you export a project and you bring it in, after working on that project, or you've exported a certain number of entities and you've worked on those entities with the global IDs, it'll basically match up the entities. So you don't have to, essentially copy paste that data over. The global IDs will match up, the information gets merged, and that takes care of that. But the other ID is the project ID, and that project ID is just a number of when the, so if you're looking at, I'll go back to database view on this. So if you're looking at this ID over here on the right-hand column, those are the IDs that have been created within the project, which have, it's a numerical sequence. So it's just going to be how those entities were created within the project. But initially, if you're going to have this global ID over here, that's just going to be a random number that's generated to show the, to basically allow you to merge the information if you've taken that out, worked on it in some other way, or you've assigned this type of work to another group, and that group has worked on this information on their own time, but your project hasn't changed. As soon as you import it, it will merge the information together. So that way you don't have to, the global IDs will match up, and you don't have to try and find the stuff all over again. It'll just import it, match it with the global IDs, and you will have the information merged together.
Thank you, Mike. Our next question is, are the rules behind the feature quality check predefined rule based on, or are they implemented using another approach? Is it possible to customize the check rules?
Very good question. It is not, as far as I know, it is not, the quality checker is not customizable. Essentially what happened, there are parameters in which the quality checker uses to go against, I think it's 6 out of the 9 criteria. Essentially what you need to do is have a little bit of human interaction in order to refine some of the areas that are not easily scored when it comes to the quality checker. So in this case, if we're talking about a requirement, let me get to an actual requirement. Open. So if we're talking about the requirement here, that there's all of the ones like clear, complete, consistent, correct, design. I think correct isn't one of them, but design, feasible, and traceable. There's 6 out of these 8 that are typically utilized in the quality score. And there isn't a way to customize it, but you can add your own criteria into this as an attribute into the requirement class utilizing the schema editor, and all you have to do is once you add it in is then utilize that as part of your quality checking. But we're not going to get away from the human interaction as it comes, or the human in the loop as it comes to doing requirements and utilizing automation completely as part of the entire process. We do need to be able to analyze our requirements and understand where the human interaction is, and not make it completely automated simply by a level of convenience. As system engineers, we do have to understand that we are part of the loop of the engineering process, and that we are being able to look at a system and determine if it is feasible, if we can trace it out, if it is verifiable, and running through this criteria at least, to make sure that we're setting a level of fidelity within the program and not just letting a computer do it. If we don't do the analysis, then essentially we're not understanding our project as a whole, getting to know it, understanding the concept, understanding the complexity that might be entailed, and what we need to do as part of the analysis in this portion. And that this is a great question, because it touches on management as well, where we need to also be able to manage these requirements to understand that this might be a performance requirement, or this might be need to have some type of safety requirement added to it. I could also be able to derive a requirement from this. If we just left it to the quality checker, we wouldn't have any derived requirements to really bring out, because we just fix the requirement and move on. So being able to have at least 6 out of the 8 or 5 out of the 8 being analyzed, which are the fairly easier ones, we can also utilize the recommendations from the tool to help us identify the better requirement, as well as identifying, looking at the requirement, identifying if the requirement is actually feasible, if it's traceable, which it should be, or if it doesn't impact another requirement. So is it correct? Does it maintain consistency? Is it, this is where the HSI of system engineering really becomes an important part of understanding the project up front, so we can make sure that we're not lost in the weeds as we move further down the line. And leaving it up to automation can really increase that risk. So it's intentional, but it's also maintainable, that we don't completely remove the human from the loop in that regard. But great question.
Thanks, Mike. Our next question is, how difficult is it to change the functional baseline when an engineering change proposal is approved?
Another great question. So if we're talking about a requirements baseline, essentially what you're going to want to do is to capture that engineering change proposal and then create the new baseline. Once you create the new baseline, anything that's changed after that is going to be basically a new requirement and a new set of baseline requirements. Now, if you do have an engineering change proposal come in and it's approved, and you want to implement that, then the best thing to do is to once you've implemented that proposal and you've changed the requirements to meet that, baseline those requirements and give a justification or some type of decision point as to why. So you can simply have their relationship, which is it's a decision. So it enables a decision here, and you just have that decision as, based on engineering change request or proposal, and you can have that in there, and basically adding the decision. If we create the decision, you can see that there's a justification on the assumptions, and that just gives you the fidelity and the legality of why that was changed after a baseline.
Thanks, Mike. Our next question is, does a docx file need to be formatted in a particular manner to be properly imported? For example, header levels 1, 2, 3.
Well, essentially docx formatting, a lot of times the auto numbering feature gets utilized a lot, and it's fixing the auto numbering that becomes the problem. So I've worked on that a lot of times where I've had to copy and paste the entire document into a notepad file, then bring it back in to clear the auto numbering formatting that has happened. So that's one of the biggest problems that we typically tend to run into. If you're going to do the typical format for any Word doc or any CSV is just having the headers of, well, the CSV itself is having the headers identified, but in a docx format, you're going to have a number and then a header or a name that's over a paragraph, and then the paragraph will be the description. The tool should recognize that as the number, the header is the name, and then the description as the paragraph below that. So you can certainly preview that before you save it into the database. And if you need to, essentially sometime what will happen is that when you look at the preview and there's, you think you've got it correct, there might still be auto formatting, auto numbering within the docx. And it's just it's something that it's hard to get around because of, how Microsoft has built it in, but most of the time you can turn on where your paragraph indicators are or your line indicators, and once you turn that on, you can see where the issues are and take those out, remove them, and then reformat it correctly, and then you should be able to bring it in fairly easily. But it's been a hassle trying to work with the auto numbering and formatting through that. But particularly the easiest format is just having putting in one dot and then utilizing a name and then a paragraph below that. And then, if you have children of that, then it's 1.1 and utilizing that just to get the data into the tool. Then you can utilize the tool to auto number your information as need be. So.
Thank you, Mike. Our next question is, what is the optimum PC system required to effectively run Innoslate on my PC or Apple?
It can be, well, so I'm running off of an Apple right now, so it can definitely run off of Apple. So OS X, whatever, anything. As far as I've worked on OS, the iOS, it's been High Sierra, Mojave, and Catalina, and those have worked just fine. And for PC, the one that we had the most trouble with was 8, but that's only because of the touch screen and stuff like that. So, but once 10 was released, it's easily solid, no big deal. You do want to make sure that you have at least, I believe it's 8 megs of RAM or higher. Maybe it might be 4. Actually, it might be 4, but just enough space. It's a web application, so as long as you can run websites, you should be able to use the tool without any issues. That just becomes a a browser issue, and then the ISP issue. So again, it's a web application, so just being able to utilize, I mean, I can use it on a tablet. My boss uses it on a tablet. I've used it on my phone before, so it's platform independent. And you can definitely utilize it as long as you can get to a browser. There's no real storage requirements because everything is saved in the cloud. So just being able to making sure that you have enough RAM to be able to run the backend memory of that, you should be fine. And that usually should be around 4 to 8 gigs.
Thank you, Mike. And while you were answering that question, I copied and pasted it to the website. I'm going to send this to everyone here, the requirements for Innoslate Enterprise. And that's all that we have time for today for questions. I'd like to thank everyone again for coming and let you know that we are also offering a one-day online training courses right now. The courses are hands-on and interactive, and we also will have our next 3 one-hour webinar on MBSE using Innoslate on August 4th at 2 p.m. That is for free. And you can check out all of our events at innoslate.com/events. And we'd like to thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. As a reminder, we'll be following up with you very soon with the link and the recording. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.